The summer school is really all about bringing together two supposedly distinct streams of research, people studying the dynamics of music and people studying the dynamics of language, and we're trying to create a synergy to figure out what we can sort of learn from each other. And so in order to structure this discussion, we have a few questions that, from the summary of all of your talks that we wanted to get at. But before we proceed, Chris Kello would like to sort of summarize some of the big questions that we began this workshop with. And he doesn't need a microphone.
No, I don't think I need that. Thank you, Ramesh. So good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure to be up here and with all of these colleagues and have such a great workshop in summer school. So the first thing is a big thank you. So we have to thank Ramesh. He has been amazing in putting this all together. How about a huge round? When we first got this started, I don't think I could have envisioned how well this has gone and how amazing it's been. So incredible. What I want to do is tell you a little bit about the origins of this by way of showing you the intellectual merits from the project description that got this thing funded, which brings me to another applause that we have to do for the National Science Foundation, who have funded this thing. Very lucky to have the funding for this. So here's the top of the project summary. I know, it's been a long time, so why don't we just take a look at that for a minute? I guess I can read it. That language and music might be have shared origins, representations, or a neural basis is much debate. Both language and music involve perceptually discrete elements organized into hierarchically structured sequences. For example, language as morphemes combine the words, phrases into sentences. In music, you've got tones into chords into progressions, and the resulting keys or tonal areas are regulated in terms of structured movement. Okay? So language and music are social in their origins, and we've definitely certainly talked quite a bit about that, with communication being an important goal for both, and so on and so forth. So I don't need to keep going. So what I wanted to do, so I really enjoyed all the discussion, and I think it's just been, you never know, this was our idea 2 years ago or something like that, and you don't know how it's going to take shape. So what I thought we could do is maybe just address a little bit of this top part about the structure of language and the structure of music. So what I wanted to kick off and then have our speakers address is similarities and differences of language and music, specifically with respect to this hierarchically structured sequences. So this was part of, I think, the idea, right? I'm sure you kind of already get it and know this, but just to put it in black and white. So it does seem to be that there's something about language and music that fundamentally, and maybe this is important, maybe it's something about human cognition and human nature in general, right? That they have this hierarchicalness to them. I don't need to go into this in more detail. This is pretty basic 101 stuff, right? So, okay, that's cool. So that's at least one similarity between language and music. But for me, I think what got me at least interested in thinking about this was also, okay, fine, so that's a similarity, but how about the differences, right? And specifically with respect to this hierarchical structuring. What about, it does seem to me at least, that there's something importantly different about music and language. And this is what I'd like to address. You can agree with me. I think it's somewhat provocative. You can disagree with me. So I'm going to just argue in just 2 slides, and then we're going to open up to discussion. So start thinking about this. We want everybody to kind of jump in. I would say that most musical structures, okay, I'm not talking about performance per se. I'm talking about the sort of structural version. It's kind of like the competence-performance distinction. This would be more like the competence of at least Western music, certainly. Compose of these fairly regularly structured hierarchies. They tend to be fairly precise. There's quite a bit of repetition used. They're fairly clean and easy to formalize, relatively speaking, right? Whereas language, while it still has these hierarchical structures, it seems much more difficult to, capture them in a clean, formalized way. They tend to be quite imprecise. They tend to be fairly non-repetitive, right? And like I said, messy to formalize. So I want us to think about this. This is what kind of sometimes keeps me up at night. I think this is a very interesting question for me because I'm interested in fractals. And so when I think about music and language, this is how I think about it. So I'm not saying that music is a fractal. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. That's not my point. I'm not saying that language is a fractal. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But fractals come in these two flavors, very fundamentally, right? You've got very regular, very rule-governed fractals like the ones that you see on the left. And then you've got nature's fractals, which are very sort of rough and irregular and kind of, but clearly you can see the similarities when you go from left to right. So for me, when I think about this hierarchical structuring, which is in and of itself a little bit of a fractal, I think of music more like what you see on the left. Again, metaphorically, and language is what you see on the right. So that would be my sort of way of provoking a discussion about this, but I think we should be open to anything about just, the name of this workshop is Dynamics of Music and Language, and talking about the similarities of dynamics of music and language. Finally, to really get provocative about this. So if you get into the performance aspect of it, to me, I see some similar distinctions to be made between music and language. So, and this has come up, I think, quite a bit already in this workshop, right? So when you think of musical performances, obviously I made these slides like 10 minutes ago. So there's the gamelan. I went quickly, internet, got to find a gamelan picture. It's a great talk. So when we think of musical performance as a form of communication, it can be, right? Not always. Of course, there's improvisation, there's jazz, etc. But what seems to be uniquely human about it, perhaps one of the reasons why we don't see animals doing this kind of thing, not a reason, but a way of sort of pointing it out, is that it is so regular and regimented. Whereas when you look at coordination, which might include synchronization, no, that's not working, sorry. Which might include synchronization like the fireflies on the bottom right. I know it's a dark picture, you can't really see it. But even in the synchronization case in nature, it's messy. It's not the kind of synchronization that I would argue that we see with music. Now, I think clearly there's interesting similarities and overlap here, but to me, this is an interesting distinction to make. When you see synchronization in nature, it's of this messy type, for example, in swarming-like behaviors, schooling in this case, or fireflies even when it is synchronization. So I'm going to put that out there. And then I would love to just hear everybody's thoughts about whatever you want to say about the similarities and differences between music and language. David?
Well, I can pick up on a couple of things. First of all, one of the differences I think has to do with we've heard a lot about the social character of both speech and music. And I have no doubt that in music in particular, the social aspect has been very important. But when you look at what's going on with the consumption of music today, the vast majority of music consumption is actually done in an individualized context, where people are wearing their earbuds and so forth, which raises a question that it seems to suggest that the main part of what people are getting out of music is in fact not related to the social context. Now, it could have been that the origins were much more social, and it could be that maybe we see something similar in language with regard to speech kinds of things. If you think of my favorite example there is St. Augustine, who became a saint. You have to do 3 miracles to become a saint, and one of St. Augustine's miracles was that he could read without moving his lips. And so, part of what speech gives us, part of what language gives us, is a way of actually just sealing our mouths and thinking. Right? So maybe there is this individualized context also there, that language or speech serves an important role in people's lives. And even if we're not socially interacting, maybe there's a parallel there between the individualized consumption that happens with music and the individualized use of language just up here. But I think it's something that raises an interesting problem of why are people so attracted to the use of music in this individualized, non-socialized context.
I've got some comments about that. I'm not sure I agree that because it's individualized, that way it's not social. And I guess I just point up 2 things. At the moment, I'm the father of a 15-year-old girl, and yes, indeed, she spends a lot of time alone in her room listening to her music. And if I put on my music in the car, she puts in her earbuds and listens to that. But when she's in her room with her friends, or they're riding in the car, their main activity is dancing to music, or singing along with the words, each one showing that they know, trying to show they know the words better than the other one. So, and they're the main, I think, I mean, I don't know the music business like you know the music business, but I think girls of that age and boys of that age are the main consumers of music,
Well,
at least in America.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think, and it may be that the social role happens, in those prime periods. As people get older, it does seem to be the case that they become much more individualized with their music consumption.
But the other point that I would make is, with these music recommendation systems, right?
Yeah.
The most successful way to recommend music to someone is not to try and do some automatic detection of musical features and say they want something happy or sad. It's to say, what music is this person's social group listening to? What music are your friends listening to? That's the most important predictor of what music you're going to like. So, I mean, so there are social aspects, even within this individualized context.
Oh, there could be other explanations for that, right?
I would just point out one thing, so we're comparing things kind of on the same level.
Could you speak up a little bit on it?
I would just point out one thing, so we're comparing things on the same level, which is when you read, even alone, which would be kind of an allegory for the personalized music listening, your reading is based on the fact that you're a very good speaker and you have all this practical experience speaking. And so music consumption, when we're talking about this, we must also relate it to whatever music you're actually producing or whatever you're dancing to or singing. Because otherwise those things, it seems to me at least now in music, those are becoming dissociated, when in language they really aren't. We can still read and base our reading on our speaking abilities.
I wonder if when people are doing things alone, it's still not a sort of surrogate social experience. So when you listen to music, you know that somebody created that music. And when I ask my students, when I teach my music cognition class, I always ask them why they're taking this course, because most of them are not in music cognition, but they all like music. And the main response I get is they say, I can't imagine not having music. And I say, well, when do you listen to it? Why do you listen to it? And they say, well, if I'm having a bad day, I listen to this song, and this person's feeling exactly what I'm feeling. And I know that there's somebody else out in the world who's feeling what I'm feeling, and that makes me feel better. So they're listening by themselves, but I think in some sense, it's like a virtual social experience. And I think the same is often true when we read. If you read a novel, it's sort of an early form of virtual reality. You're in another world, and if it's a good novel, you really identify. You feel like the characters are real, and you feel like you're part of that world. So again, I think it can be a surrogate sort of social experience.
So I just wanted to situate this back in the context of some of the talks and the other discussions that we've had here, which is, music and language are both trying to represent reality in some way. So that the structural similarities that we see, say, like from Dale's talk, between speech and music might have something to do with the fact that they co-evolved, or that they're both really about the same thing, with their experiences that we want to represent. And implicit in a number of the talks, beginning with David's and till even the last talk, was about music representing something, these sort of metaphoric ideas. And Teeny wanted to bring up a couple of points about metaphor in music, and I just wanted to make sure that gets expressed.
Okay, did you want me to do that now?
Sure.
So my line of research, one of my main lines of research is metaphor, and I do that in language. And a number of the talks touched on things that seem like metaphor to me. And I even teach a class on metaphor and thought, and we have an entire week on metaphor in music, and we talk about why is high pitch called high pitch, and why is low pitch called low pitch, and things like that. And it's very hard for people in general to think about metaphor metaphorically because it's so natural. So I guess I just wanted to put that out there. In language, we have lots and lots of metaphor. About every third or fourth sentence we utter has some kind of metaphor in it. It's not always obvious. It doesn't have to be an idiom or a poetic metaphor, but it comes up all the time. So I just wanted to get some people's thoughts on metaphor in music.
My favorite metaphor in music is when rubato was added to the music And what people always say is it makes the music come alive. There's something about agency and something about living or breathing quality that seems to be important as a metaphor for what happens in music. But that's just what I...
So you're not a fan of house music?
When I want to bang my head, I'm a head banger like anybody else. No, I like dance music, but it's music for dancing.
Yeah.
But that's a metaphor about music, that's not a metaphor in music, right? I think it's very difficult to find a metaphor. A musical metaphor is almost a contradiction in terms. I mean, how can you represent something in music that's not music?
Well, certainly you can put train sounds in your song and bird songs and many people, many composers of music have done that.
But that would be a simile rather than a metaphor.
Yeah, and some metaphor researchers, including myself, we include simile with metaphor. Conceptually, it's the same.
Right.
Could meter be considered a metaphor for motor action?
Could what?
That's also...
Could meter be considered a metaphor for motor action?
Or a galloping rhythm,
Yeah.
a metaphor for a horse gallop.
Yeah, so there's that.
And the reason I looked at you, David, when she asked that question is I wonder, if you were going to, make the case that, a lot of the issues you raised in conjunction with the musical communication of emotion were somehow metaphorical. Or do you think of it that way, or would you object to us saying, that high acute sounds are somehow a metaphor, or they?
Well, there's so many different perspectives on it. Usually my preferred way of thinking about it is the signal cue distinction in ethology, because I think that's quite a helpful way of looking at it. But yeah, you can switch gears and look at it, and yeah, it's both.
But I think that was a very good point about motor, because I think the theory of the embodied theory of melody hasn't really yet been created in this sense. That musical melodies, phrases make gestures, right? They rise in pitch, they fall in pitch, they can do things like rebound, they can be heavy or light, or they can be buoyant, they can. So music is a metaphor for an embodied experience, but it's in a space that somehow has gravity in it, but it's also not it's not quite the same as living in our bodies. One time, Manfred Kleins told me that he remarked that he was a pianist, or he is a pianist, and he found that when he went up a scale in classical music, he'd be more legato, and notes would be more solid and heavy. And when he came down, he would make a much nicer impression if he sort of bounced down. So he'd do ba 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 bum 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 bum. I mean, that's of course a caricature, right? And I said, well, it's obvious. It's because you're in imaginatively or an embodied experience of going up the stairs and then bouncing down the stairs. And he said, yes, that's right. Well, I still think that, and I think that at some level, our experience, and I'm thinking of instrumental music here, of course, is there. So in a sense, it's a metaphor for a kind of a dreamlike experience of a kind of a expressive movement, expressive gesturing and movement, but in a sense that I've never been able to actually find equations for, find a basis for. And so in that sense, I think the idea of a metaphor is, music in that sense is a metaphor for a kind of a embodied free experience that's free of what was the quote that I had of the Shaker thing, the dust of everyday life, and perhaps the gravity, the limitations of our bodies.
Just for the record, I want to say, if we had another title to the summer school, it would have been Dynamics of Music, Language, and Movement. So in some way, I think movement kind of brings together these two in this sort of embodied framework. I mean, rhythm rhythm and speech, rhythm and language, rhythm and music, I think is a sort of unifying factor. And perhaps the metaphor kind of stems from some sort of simulated theory.
If I might add a little addendum to what Scott's just said here, I think what would be interesting is that we know there's some languages in which there's a different metaphor for pitch. The most common other metaphor is big and small, in which case this, the Manfred Klein situation with the scale, how would, bigger, as you go down becoming bigger, it seems to me that it would be interesting to know to the extent that cultural metaphors would influence how you would articulate something like a scale, so that the bouncing thing would no longer work, because culturally they have a different
Should
metaphor.
get heavier.
It would be interesting to see whether that's
I'll give you one
But you
example
could
of
look
that.
the other way at
in
language.
Indonesian, right? Yeah. It's big and small, right?
Yeah, it's big and small, but also I'd point out there's an instrument called ginder, which you play with two hands. It's kind of simple polyphony. And every melody that you learn on this instrument, they're improvised sort of licks that you learn, but they're all named. And there's one where you run from the lower end all the way up and then you come back down, kind of like Scott was describing. The name of that melody is Putuk Galut, which means the servants are fighting. And it means it's like the servants are fighting up and fighting, they're like chasing each other up and down the scale. And people talk about how you would descend or how you descend. But it's a very similar idea.
I thought about going the other direction in terms of language. I think it's far underappreciated, the automatopoeia in language. And so that to the extent that language, the sounds of language themselves have a meaning that they transfer without, that we are far too little aware of, I think. I mean, I amuse myself sometimes by thinking of the collection of words that has to do with bulging and billowing and ball and the bowl and the bowel and the bilious and belly and
I hope the dinners agree with me.
well, no, you go on and you realize, well, what do they have in common? And what they have in common, and I think our language is much more suffused with that. So those words have a meaning. Those English words have a meaning that we're conveying without really realizing it. That really relates to physical embodied, experience, and then convey some aspect of the meaning of those words.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was thinking the same thing for text painting. When you're talking about the idea of reflecting in the music what's happening as best it was from that was still descending, king running down, and all the notes are doing that, so on and so forth. And then what you were saying about the things being named, the rhythmic in the other thing, percussionists, their names reflect what they're doing on their instruments when they're learning their rudiments. So it's kind of interesting as well.
Yeah, so I had an interesting conversation with Joe Plazak, so just to put him on the spot. And it was very intriguing because there's a lot of discussion now, not about, well, metaphor is very important and interesting in itself, but we had a conversation about the use of sarcasm in composition and performance in music. And so it would be cool to hear from you if you're willing to share a few words about that, because that's an interesting potential bridge between linguistic pragmatics and music and how you're looking at it.
Because both linguists and musicians can be very sarcastic. Is that
Apparently.
It's a bit of a departure from metaphor, but I just think that when you look at the similarities between music affect and language affect, you find a lot of commonalities in the prosody. And so that's what the sarcasm research sort of found, is you look at the cues that people use to express something like sarcasm in the voice, and then you can go and look at the music and find a very similar code.
But it's also, and this is something we discussed as well, is that irony and sarcasm they have relatively strict definitions in a way as well, even though they're sort of more organic, fluid manifestation, can have different and interesting properties and so on. But in music, you can be playful about it, introducing certain kinds of segments, or maybe when we jam tonight, I might sing some Britney Spears or something like that. And so it serves as sort of, maybe that one would be less sarcastic. because I am a secret lover of Britney Spears. But the idea would be that utilizing these kinds of passages serves some sort of semantic role in a way that's similar to linguistic sarcasm. You're sort of stating something that's opposite to the truth. It's like, I'm jamming out a new Justin Bieber tune. But do they use sarcasm in that sense as well, or the function of the passage of music?
I think you're communicating two different things in speech and music, and a useful distinction that I recently picked up is this idea of transactional information versus some sort of relational information. And speech tends to really be good at the transactions in life, the things that need to be done quickly, but the relational information is sort of what colors the transaction. And music seems to really thrive in that domain.
Joe's being modest, by the way. There's much more to talk about. I mean, he's done some great work on these recordings that he's done of a saxophone playing in a sarcastic manner. These, we think that the sarcasm in speech you can immediately tell, but it's really striking when you hear musicians playing in a sarcastic fashion. It's just really striking. It really wallops you, and you've got great stimuli.
I had a second question if people would like to indulge in this one. So music is full of embellishment. I used to play trumpet and I used to play a lot of Baroque music, and I remember doing Italian trills and French trills and glissandos and these sorts of things, right? And sometimes the function of those seemed like it was about anticipation, right? Probably not always. I guess I just want to take it back to language now. What's the analog of that sort of embellishment, ornamentation in language? Maybe I'll point at Rick, since you're interested in and ah and synchrony and interaction sorts of things. What function might you see with embellishment in language?
Embellishment?
Yeah, what will it?
Well, I guess I'll just mention somebody else's research. Michael Ramskar has been doing some interesting things recently about predictive cues in language. I'm trying to think of some nice examples he's come up with, but the idea is that some of the embellishments that we use are sometimes informationless, and so I'm trying to think of something that might be. So I'm continually talking, right? And you're sort of anticipating that something might come up, and so what I have to share is entirely meaningless. So I just concocted my own Michael Ramskar example. But the idea is that
one thing you're doing is this.
Yeah.
Gesturing.
Gestures.
Sorry, go.
And so I won't talk for too long, but the idea that Ramskar has is that their language actually has, and he actually has some nice examples from first and last names as well, that you have an initial element that's actually not especially informative. In a sense, it's high probability and uninteresting, but it gets your attention so that you actually can pay attention to the subsequent most informative part. So if I'm doing a filled pause and I'm sort of filling the space with material, then I'm preparing you to hear something really deep and interesting as it comes up. So I think that there are some elements like that in language. I'm struggling to think of a good example.
What about
rhetoric? Isn't rhetoric indeed the embellishment of speech?
In what sense?
That you add affect to your speech to make people listen to you more, not to increase the message you have, but to increase its impact on the person you're.
So in Wayne's World, there's a great scene where Wayne's girlfriend gives him a gun rack, and he's like, I don't even own a gun, let alone many guns that would necessitate an entire rack. So when he says add, he's deviating from the expected, like A or 1, to play with the expectation and be like, not even this. And by using, I don't even know if you'd call that a marked form, but anywhere that you're deviating from the expectation, you're signaling to people like, this is the crux. Like, this is an important part of all that boring stuff I'm saying.
Well, David, you talked and gave examples of the crack in the voice of the country singer, and that's certainly embellishment, almost literally.
I think if we were to look for speech parallels to music, if we're thinking of music as performance, maybe this regular conversation is not the best example, but I'm thinking like political speeches or or religious speeches like preachers, like the "I have a dream" speech, right? There's a lot of structure there and repetition and slight variation, which is very similar to music.
I would say you have epithet too. So every time you say morning, you say the rosy fingered dawn. And then in some types of music, you don't just play da. Every time you play that note, you have to approach it a certain way, or it comes with a whole phrase. So that might be relevant too.
Now, no one came back to structure, and the unfolding structure across time, which is, of course, both in music and in speech or text. And that's a whole another topic, right? That wasn't really, there was no one representing that topic here. Right. That's also a fascinating avenue for research. I got some point interested in the golden ratio, which actually you do find in classical music, and either quite overtly. I mean, Bartók, they found the Fibonacci numbers written in the margins of his manuscript, so he knew about it. But even I recently played a free-form piece by Bach, and it was there very markedly as well. So that's an example of this sort of similar unfolding pattern. And of course, the other obvious one is the 2/4/8/16, which goes in Indonesian music to 128 256.
Right.
And so the whole idea of how music is structured, or continuous text is structured, to create manageable units, and how associations are made from small statements at the beginning to elaborations and building on. I think that is there's strong parallels there between music and text, but they relate to not our sense of rhythm, because our sense of rhythm drops out, at beats slower than 2 seconds per beat or something. And then we get into this gray area where we're really not aware of periodicity or period lengths or timing. We only have a learned and very visceral sense of it. It's beyond, I don't know how many seconds, 10 seconds. It doesn't even stay in our iconic memory, right? So. I think there's a lot to be learned about unfolding across time of either discourse or of complex music.
Yeah, so I was hoping this might come up because there's a really interesting paper by Dan Lloyd, who's a philosopher and scientist at Trinity College in Connecticut. He has this really awesome paper in Frontiers that came out, I think, a year or two ago. And what he did is he took a massive fMRI database for which he had a dynamic volt signal change, and he used ICA to infer symbol processes. And then he took 700 language texts, and then he took hundreds of musical pieces. And what he did is he quantified the sparsity of these symbolic forms. So how much do they fill the space of possible symbol sequences? And then he compared them. And what do you think will look most similar among brain symbol sequences, music symbol sequences, and linguistic symbol sequences? What do you think?
You mean the two of those that were the most similar?
No, the two of those that were the most similar, yeah.
That's an interesting question.
By a wide margin. It was
Music and
mind and music.
Mind and music. Mind and music.
Mind and music, yeah, were considerably sparser. He has these beautiful figures in his paper that he entitled Mind as Music. And he ends up arguing against Fodor's language of thought hypothesis. He says it's really the music of thought, and we should really be understanding these sorts of chord progressions that compose our thought processes. But he used this sort of data-driven approach to identify the structural sequences. It's pretty cool.
Very cool.
Yeah, just kind of following that, I mean, I think it raises the issue of what are the spans, the time spans over which we attend and integrate information, and it gets to those tree structures that you showed. And while it is true that one can generate those both for language and music, I think it's much more important. They're more relevant in the case of language in terms of the relationship to
comprehension of the meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And that while you can compose pieces that have all this prolongational structure that can be analyzed as such, I think it's far from clear that listeners, your average listener, especially your emotional listener, that Scott was referring to, is even integrating, or that's even relevant to integrate over such long spans, because you can have so much more local meaning. So that individual musical objects are already imbued with deep emotional meaning, or little figures and things like that. So
how about the composer though? I mean, so
the composer. I mean, we all create great, wonderful things, or composers can create beautiful, large-scale structures.
This is a question out of ignorance. I mean, in music, how often are composers paying attention to structure across multiple scales of a piece, from local to the whole thing and everything in between?
Those are called good composers.
Right, that's what I thought, but again, I don't know.
I'm not the best person to ask that, but I think certainly in the classical music tradition, that's common. And then related to this issue of the spans over which we integrate is another really important difference that actually Lisa Margulis, who's here, has pointed out nicely in a recent book that she wrote on repetition and the use of repetition, and just how that's much more common. I mean, it's a staple of music, whereas in language it just makes for a boring lecture.
Right, exactly.
So I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Well, honestly, I would just keep thinking over the course of this conversation that one thing that's really different for me when I listen to music versus when I listen to speech, when I listen to music, I'm kind of singing along with it in my head, or I'm, even if I'm not doing anything overt, I'm imagining what's going to come next, and then that tune might get stuck in my head later. Whereas when I'm listening to speech, I'm not normally imaginatively participating in that way. So that just seems like a really different mode of orientation that we bring to experience.
Just following up on that, I think one of the other distinctions is that tunes get stuck in your head. And it's rare that a phrase or sentence gets stuck in your head. I mean, those things do happen, but it's really common in music that things get stuck in your head. So what is it about those things that makes them so tenacious?
But don't we have phenomena like shadowing in speech? Don't we see these sort of motor theory-like speech motor activations when we listen to speak? So I wonder, so you're listening to me speak right now, and you are sort of following along, right? So it might not give you the same enjoyment as listening to music, but you're still comprehending what I'm saying, etc. And you couldn't really do that unless you're tracking it, and unless you have expectations, and unless you know where it's going, and unless you know what kind of communication situation it's embedded in, right? So is that really a difference? I'm wondering.
I think that's true, Ramesh, but there's still a fundamental difference in that we play the same song over and over again. We don't listen normally to the same exact bit of speech over and over again. And in music, we tend to play our music at the same time. You can have chant and response, but typically we play together, whether in unison or not. Whereas in speech, we may interrupt each other slightly, but it's more back and forth. And music just makes a much more demands on the temporal processing, in the sense that you've got to be there at the right time. Whereas in language, you can pause a little bit and collect your thoughts and so on. So yes, it has a temporal structure that resembles many aspects of musical temporal structure, but there's a fundamental difference there in how it's performed. And that music has to keep going.
But there's also performance language.
There is, but I think once you get into sort of poetry and so on, you're halfway to music. To me, that's
it's not language anymore, it's music.
Well, I think it's part way to music,
Yeah.
because it's got a temporal structure, and yes, you can't pause in it. It's got, the rhymes are more like sort of musical sound elements. So I do think it's part way.
Well, you're performing language right now, and if you pause 10 milliseconds too long, I'm going to hear something as one consonant instead of another. So in that sense,
at that level, that's
right. Timing is critical.
Also, if you don't follow the prosody and the rhythmic structures of speech, and you're kind of talking really awkwardly, people aren't going to want to listen to you. So you're not going to have the chance to orate or even participate in conversations. So I'll talk to you for about 15 seconds, and that's it for me. So I think that to a degree, there is a rhythmicity that we have to have in our speech and timing in order to be understood and to, like you were saying about the gun, right? Leaning into that and making that emphasis and pausing says a lot about what I'm actually saying. What I'm actually saying. So I think there's a lot of it even in our everyday speech.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. I think it's just a matter of degree, the difference between music and language.
So just to sort of go back to Lisa's idea of repetition. So why is musical repetition? So let's just say we listen to the same piece over and over again. Why? I mean, I know that people do get bored with some music and they move on. But what is different about musical stimuli? Is it the tonal variation? What is it about repetition that?
Well, I have a couple of different ways of thinking about that. But one is that all the speech researchers in here probably know about the semantic satiation effect, right? Where if you just take a word, you repeat it a bunch of times, you stop being aware of what the word means, and you become aware of these weird qualities of how the word's pronounced and so forth. And it may be that in language, when you get down to that level, it's not really that informative, or that's not where the content is. It's really interesting. Whereas in music, if you get your attention shoved down to the level of nuance, like the way a guitar is bending the string or something, or if you get it pushed up to something about the hierarchic relationships in this Beethoven symphony, that really is rewarding, that there's just that rich kind of informative, expressive structure at all those levels that rewards the shift in attention brought on by listening repeatedly.
So the question might be, why is our culture so bereft of musical speech?
Actually, that's probably not true. I mean, some of the most highly selling genres of popular music involve musical speech, right?
Well, you mean rap?
And many other forms of music worldwide. In fact, we had a conversation about bossa nova the other day. If you look at Brazilian music, Roberto Carlos, for example, a girl from Ipanema, it kind of sounds like, well, although, Peter will argue there's actually sort of tones dancing over there, but it is like speech, right? So it depends on what kind of, it's not, you won't find it in.
So so you're talking about speech in music, but I'm thinking of outside of music. I mean, for instance, black preachers, right? Like the King's Speech, where they would come back to the same word, and they come back to the same word. I remember going by a black church in San Francisco in 1964 or something, and a few of us stopped at the door because there was some sort of service going on, and the preacher was calling to the audience, exhorting them to good behavior, of course, and proper faith, and the audience was responding with affirmations, and then he had an electric guitar in his hand, and solo, he would go to this riff, he would, and then he'd go on to another Bible verse, So there are pockets of rhythmic speech, musical speech, I should say, with all these musical qualities that that was one experience I had, and rap and is another, because they mostly take melody out of it. It's closer to speech, but I think
Protest chant.
Protest chants.
Prayer.
Yeah. I mean, recitation of the Quran is.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. In other cultures, there's been much more of that.
But recitation of the Quran is based on some very, very fundamental scales, right? I mean, if you listen to Peter Gabriel's Passion of the Christ, there's entire sections sung by Baba Mal, which are incredible. And they actually have annual competitions in Mecca. It is just spoken word, but it's very much there. It is there in many other cultures.
Let me make a point that I think the whole conversation here exemplifies in a way, and it has to do with the similarities and differences between music and language. And I guess I would argue that, and we're demonstrating it here with many of the questions that people are asking, that language is so rich, so complex, 6,000 languages, 250 phonemes, all manner of organization, so that a person like Chomsky, for example, who wants to ask a very simple question about language, is there a universal grammar, sort of comes a cropper, and no one really agrees, I think, today, as far as I understand it, that there is a universal grammar. So to me, one enormous difference between language and music is that whereas language is enormously complicated with so many variables that even the simplest question you can think of asking has not been answered, contrasts greatly with music, which is quite simple, really, in a way, despite all its complexity. Everybody uses 12 tones of the chromatic scale. Everybody likes 7 and 5 tone combinations, subsets of those. Everybody has the same sense of consonance and dissonance. Everybody has many, many aspects of music held in common. And there you can ask, because of the relative simplicity, some pretty serious scientific questions. Why does everybody like the chromatic scale or use the chromatic scale? Why is it that people like the diatonic scale or use that? Why is it that folk music tends to use the pentatonic scale? Why is it that everybody has the same sense of consonance and dissonance? These are manageable questions that I think, in contrast to language where we could talk forever about metaphors, Emily, and all the things that we've been talking about, which are obviously important and fascinating, but they don't lend themselves to science, and music does. For me, that's the fundamental difference between the two categories, and why at least I'm optimistic about music as a domain in which science can really get a toehold and answer some very basic questions that tell you a lot about how the brain works. Sorry to be so pontifical, but it's a really fun.
I mean, the musicologists here have to raise some objections to what you said there, and notably regarding the purported universality of the 12 chromatic scale. All of the cultures that use that are all Indo-European. It's from Persia over to India and so on. They all speak very similar languages. They all come from.
Well, no, the Dravidian system just to set the record straight, is Carnatic music, where you showed examples from, is not Indo-European.
Yes, that's true,
Right.
but it's very strongly influenced by, as is Finnish and Hungarian and so on, that are not Indo-European languages. And of course, this all happens in Africa and other parts of the world too, because of the export of Western culture. But there are places in the world, Australian Aboriginal music, which doesn't, there are just so many exceptions there. There's no doubt that Western music has completely dominated the world here.
Yeah, but I mean, again, I would go with the example of Carnatic music, which, as Ramesh says, is not from the same linguistic tradition. And
yeah, but you can't possibly say that it hasn't been influenced by.
If you want to focus on the
Indo-European.
differences, you find infinite differences. Of course, gamelan is another good example where the metallophones of gamelan are not only different in the way they're performed, but different in the scales that they use. There are tons of exceptions. But if you took the exceptions and didn't take the commonalities that greatly outweigh the exceptions, you wouldn't get any place. You never understand music.
I disagree with that. I think there's been tremendous progress made in understanding these things. I mean, that part I agree with you. I just don't agree with the things that you've identified as being.
Okay, so what would you say is an example of progress that's been made in deeply understanding music by looking at an exception to the rule rather than the rule, which is not Western music? I mean, Carnatic music is not Western music. The classical music of Vietnam and Thailand, these are
Can I ask a question here?
So just 1 second. I think that Peter had his hand up first, and then let him finish, and then we'll get right to you.
Well, just to offer a way in which I think music is more complex than the case of language, and that is, if one looks at the various goals of each function, so one could argue that language largely has a communicative goal. Whereas with music and engaging with your music can have multiple goals. I mean, it might have emotional goals, it might have movement goals, it might have semantic goals, it might have reminiscing goals. So I think there are many more possible goals and motivations for music, and so then you have to...
Wait a minute.
Language can do all those
I know,
things.
right? And then some.
Well, yeah, sure, but still, at the end of the day, you're still it's still about communication. I mean, okay, so you
Entertainment.
well, yeah, well,
If I could just pipe in for a minute, I mean, I think it's easy to sort of oversell the universality of the chromatic scale, but I mean, I do take your general point that there are universals, what would appear to be substantive structural
Yeah,
universals.
that
in
need to be
music.
explained in
And-
scientific
and,
terms.
You know, these are the octave, the fifth, and the fourth, which are found in the music of virtually every culture, right? I mean,
I would actually.
well, okay,
There's
there may be
exceptions.
some, there are exceptions. I mean, you can't say there aren't
Actually,
exceptions.
just to make a point, and sorry, historically, if you look at the development of music, we didn't have octave scales for quite a long time. There were a few exceptions to that, like the Hittites, who worshipped the one who gave birth to the seven, and they had a heptatonic scale a long time ago. But I mean, even Gregorian scales and so forth are built in smaller steps.
But Alex, that's kind of the history of Western music. I mean, we talked, I think, I don't know whether you were here to hear the initial part of the talk, when the issue of ancient instruments came up. So those 40,000-year-old instruments that obviously antedate any historical record that's not archaeological give evidence that people were playing something like today's scales then.
Yeah, they're not that different.
They're
So,
not that
but
different.
I'm also just pointing out that there's a lot of variation in how we hear things, and for it to even say that they're octaves, that I skipped over a slide, which I just thought would be fun to demonstrate, which had a piece, because our scale that we use in Byzantine music, and octaves divided into 72 notes, and they use this today across Greece. And also, it's more modally based on fourths and fifths. So the example I was going to sing for you doesn't have an octave in it. It goes sort of a sharp seventh.
Please.
Well, it's on my slide. I don't remember it offhand. I'm sorry, but it would be something like da da na 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 na. So so there we have a large seventh rather than an octave. But those scale degrees are the same. But I don't want to argue these particulars or like to say, oh, we're talking about exceptions, because in some ways, I think you might be right in that when you take something and artistically stylize it and put it in abstract form, you do simplify some aspects of it, and it does lend itself to study. The question of universals, however, I think is a really thorny one.
It's a difficult question, but I think we're talking about one-person splitters here. And I think if you want to do science, you've got to do some lumping, or you never get any place. I mean, if you're a splitter, well,
And I think that's a
it's
fundamental
not
difference between disciplines. So
Yeah.
ethnomusicologists tend to be splitters, and they're looking for the cultural differences, whereas it's the business of psychology and neuroscience to look for what the different communication systems have in common.
But you could look for universals, but you have to realize that there are differences. So one
Absolutely.
universal I'd
Absolutely.
be very interested in is highness of pitch in voice. That seems to always indicate some intensity of emotion. You know, there's a universal. that one
David
could
gave a
look
very
at.
nice development of that.
And so that's really interesting stuff.
Sorry.
David over there.
You okay?
Okay.
If you found a group of humans that flies, you wouldn't say that humans don't fly, because most humans don't fly, right? I mean, even having a few cultures which don't have those scales, I think it's enough to say that they are not universal.
I think universal is obviously a dangerous word, and we're using it in a very, or at least I'm using it in a very vague way. I, as much as anybody else, recognize the many, many exceptions to universality. But again, unless you can find a common core to engage in as science, well, you can talk about, language and music till the cows come home, but not in a scientific context.
about the
Yeah, and I think to say something is universal, I mean, especially if you're comparing it with, sort of the Chomskyan notion of a universal grammar, does not mean it's found absolutely everywhere, okay? What it means is that it's,
It's a proclivity.
It's a proclivity, exactly. It's a
So
tendency.
that's the
and it
word I
doesn't-
would recommend,
Okay.
Don't use universal.
Mhm.
I think the word proclivity is the right.
Yeah.
I
Right,
think
and-
there's no
and-
doubt that ethnomusicologists have over-exaggerated the differences.
Yeah.
But it's just as true, that psychologists have been using, from a musicological perspective, the broad sweep that happens in musicology of these gigantic claims about music are just not warranted. And so we need to find the common ground of where we can talk about the things that are held in common and the things that are different. And ethnomusicologists, which they've now in the last few years, especially with, who am I thinking of? Who's the guy at Illinois who's well? Bruno Nettle has recently come out and said ethnomusicologists have to start doing more comparative musicology, which was anathema to ethnomusicology some time ago. So there is a movement in ethnomusicology to start moving in the direction. I think we that do music cognition need to meet them halfway. We should never use the word universals. We should say their proclivities or, we need to find some.
It also depends on what you're saying is universal. So to say a particular method of tuning or intonation is universal doesn't make any sense. What you're really looking for as a neuroscientist is the way that sound interacts with the brain.
But I think it's really
and that may lead to certain proclivities in the way musical structures develop, so that there are certain things in common between musics of very different cultures.
I mean, there's one problem, David, in what you're saying, and that is that in 50 years, it won't be a proclivity, it will truly be universal, because more and more, wherever you go in the world, you're finding, the pop music of today's culture dominant, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah, but if English becomes the only language spoken in the world, that doesn't mean that there's a universal grammar.
That's a good point.
But then also a lot of these pop musics are drawing on their traditional musics in new ways. So I hear a lot of things where people are playing keyboards that have been detuned, or they're drawing melodies that they really wouldn't be. And it's partly because of technology, because now that I was just talking with someone from Iran, the Iranians, you can just set up your Casio keyboard to whatever tuning you want. And they used to be really constrained when they brought keyboard into their music because they couldn't do this. So things are going both ways because of technology.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point too, is if I understand it correctly, musical systems are disappearing faster than languages are disappearing. And it seems, when two language groups meet, in a generation or whatever, they can create a new language, but musical systems seem to be able to meld really readily. So the more access we have to internet and so on, it seems to me that the more we have these hybrid music systems where things are really quickly integrating and creating some very exciting and interesting styles, but at the same time you wonder if it's not also at a rapid rate killing off certain kinds of music that have been around for a long time. I don't know if you guys maybe want to comment on that.
But is music being born just as fast, or no? I get the sense that new musical styles are multiple. Many of them have been born in my lifetime, whereas I would not say that about languages.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying.
So they die fast, but they're born fast too.
Yeah, you get these integrations of different styles of innovation, and if you want to call that the birth of a new style.
I don't know how it would be defined, but it seems that way to me, that there's balance there.
But and I think just to go back to the proclivities, another place you find that is obviously in rhythm. So you find deep structural similarities between rhythms of many different musical cultures. There are obviously complexities too, and there are some structures you find in some musics that you don't find in others, but there are deep structural similarities.
Yeah, I just want to make it clear that it's especially true in my writings. If anybody has been moving to writing about things that are across many cultures, I've certainly guilty, or I certainly do that. I think the problem is that we don't realize just what a bad reputation psychologists and music cognitions have amongst ethnomusicologists. And when we talk in these universal terms, it is the immediate reason why they close their ears and dismiss what it is that we're talking about. We really need these people as allies, and we should just stop provoking them. And after all, psychology isn't just about the universals. There is a personal psychology. We are interested in individual differences and so on. And there's no reason why we shouldn't, be expressing that aspect to what we do from a psychological perspective in a way that's going to meet people in ethnomusicology. I just can't tell you how much we provoke their ire. There's no, for most ethnomusicologists, the enemy in the world right now are those damn music cognition and music psychology people.
Really?
Yeah. We just provoke them like crazy. I have no idea.
I have to point out, I'm not.
But at the risk of anyone here, I think all of this sort of obscures what I think was a very important point that Dale was trying to make, which is that there are certain certain proclivities. I'll go with proclivities. That's fine. That make music a particularly appealing area for neuroscientific study. And that's the point, one of the points that I was trying to make in my introduction.
And just to add to that, this is something that came up at the end of your talk, and this is something I like very much, which is stability, not statistics.
Right.
So why do certain patterns become preferred over time? It's not because there's just more of it. It's just because there are deep physical principles on which certain preferred patterns become stable over time.
Mm-hmm.
There might be, very basic sort of thermodynamic reasons for these things. And I have a feeling, why is it that certain tones that sit really next to each other don't get selected? And they drop out, and then someone said, well, this is a good interval to go. It's really because I think that was just more stable. It was possible to make more stable neural representations of those. It was possible to express them in a more stable manner. So I really think it's a very critical distinction, the difference between stability and statistics.
Yeah. So, I think the kind of work that I described today is really just scratching the surface of what's actually possible. I've told this story before. Ira Schwartz, who's the head of the Nonlinear Systems Division at the Navy, the Naval Research Labs. He's a laser physicist and also a classical guitarist trained around the same time that I was. He sat in my office one day and listened to me talk about nonlinear dynamics in music. He said, "Ed, that's good as far as it goes, but you have no idea what you're doing." He said, in laser systems, which are governed by the same types of nonlinear dynamics, if you drive these systems hard enough, they jump between stable states, okay? And what he's really saying, translated into a musical or neurodynamic framework, is that you could get, these kinds of systems singing melodies, like stable melodies. Right. So there are all kinds of, I've only scratched the surface of the possibilities of nonlinear dynamics.
But here's a sort of interesting bridge between what Dale said and what you said, and it sounded like there was a difference, but actually I don't think there is one. So I think Dale was saying it's all biology, and you were actually making the argument that no, it's actually sort of something, a deeper physical principle.
Yeah.
But I think biology selects things that are physically more stable. Mm-hmm. So why do these tones become preferred? It's just because they were just physically more stable, neurally more stable, and you could kind of pick it up and pass it on. Mm-hmm. So why do systems of music that don't follow this stability kind of lose out? It's just because it's very hard to hold a tone that's kind of not going to stay stable. So.
I'd like to just raise one possibility for one feature of music that I would argue is potentially universal and can explain a number of these other features that we're all talking about. And that is the fact that music, if you look at indigenous communities, is produced by groups of people. All musical traditions involve more than one person producing it. And that kind of helps explain some features, like the structure Chris is pointing out. You have a predictable structure that allows groups of people to coordinate their action. It potentially addresses the issue of why we do it, which is potentially to communicate something about the group producing it. A complex composition that requires practice. The gamelan example was a really good case where that is an elaborate performance that requires huge cultural investment and a lot of time in the individuals. And so that factor might be important for the evolution of music, and then help explain things like our sensitivity to these features, these structural features that are related to speech, right, and that have been elaborated and culturally ritualized. And it also explains the variability. So adaptive radiation is a common feature that you see in signaling systems, where the variation matters because the individuals from one community need to know who they are, assorted from individuals in another community. And you see it in birdsong and languages. So I think, and it also explains entrainment, right? And so I think that there's something to be said about the feature of group performances that seems to get neglected.
And I would just make one point, touching on that. And this is one of the reasons I keep harping on this idea that, that the formalisms that I'm working with are physical principles, not necessarily biological principles, because these physical principles can operate in this multi-scale framework, from synchronization among two neurons to synchronization among individuals to synchronization of Twitter feeds when listening to Mitt Romney. So, these are principles that apply across scales and across physical systems. So,
right, so you could look at individuals as being the unit of analysis.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
I'd like to say something, pick up on Dale's point about brain studies. I mean, several of the speakers are interested in brain studies, and of course, not everyone here is interested in brain studies. But I think it's, my recent analysis of that old data I had showing that the very striking relationship to various portions of the rhythmic structure in various portions of the EEG. And then the news someone has brought up that other people are showing the same thing for EEG studies of speech, that there are places you can separate what places in the cortex are following the syllables and what spaces, or what. I'm sure you can do the same sort of parsing, what's following the sentences, what's following the phrases. So I think the possibility of becoming a neurogrammarian in language, or a neuromusicologist in music theory is really wide open now, and I think there'll be scientifically exciting discoveries to be made in that field. Of course, not everyone should rush into that field, but who knows? Maybe someone here will be inspired.
So I'd like to know if Dale really thinks language is unscientific. Or maybe that's just your estimation of my talk. Or it's not given to scientific investigation, I guess. So I get this sort of the Dale curves dialectic is essentially, for the things that you're clumping, it's all universal, and for the things that you decide aren't subject to scientific experience, it's far too complex to do any clumping whatsoever. But one would say that the very message that you're trying to convey, which I was actually quite convinced by, frankly, found it very interesting, was actually dependent upon quite a lot of research on speech and language, in fact. And so one could call it biology if you wish, and now we can call it biology because there's a great understanding of the articulators and how they're operating. But for decades, if not over a century, there are people who are fundamentally interested in language, qua language, who are studying it as such. And so it seems to me that your entire thesis, in order to explain music, actually fundamentally requires the science of language, which is quite large and extensive.
I think it requires the science of human vocalization, but not speech and language. I mean, we use speech and language because that's the database that's out there and available on the internet, but it's really about vocalization.
Don't you think that the structure of melodies and the structure of languages have an extreme interrelationship? I believe that. David was mentioning, he knows
in the structure of melody and the structure of speech.
Yeah, of connected discourse.
Of discourse.
I mean, there's studies of this.
But I think many of these things are actually consistent with what Dale said, that it has to, think of, for example, the melodic arch. So there really is objectively a tendency for phrases tend to rise up and fall down. And it looks like a very similar thing that happens with declination that happens related to the subglottal air pressure. So mainly the difference between speech, when you look at a pulmonary function, the main difference between speech and singing is that for singing we try to maintain a high subglottal air pressure in order to maintain a pitch level. So we don't want to have drooping tones and so on. So I think he's got a reasonable point that has to do with vocalization rather than speech per se, because you start looking at things like prosody and you can start seeing, oh, that's attributable to this aspect of pulmonary function. And then you can start seeing that there are very similar things going on in the music. It seems to be perfectly plausible, what Dale's claiming there.
But it seems to me, on the other hand, very plausible that, as I was mentioning earlier, that the structure of melodies in different cultures is very much related to the structure of the grammar of the language. Think of melodies as statements.
Sure, that's right.
So I gave the example, this is just anecdotal, but it occurred to me when I was living in India that since Hindi has the verb at the end, that the melodies I was hearing had some sort of turn at the end, and of course the Indian rhythm focuses on arriving at the end, beginning of the cycle, and so in a way that didn't translate. If you sang that, you made a melody, if you made a song on that in English, it wouldn't work very well, because in English we don't have a wait for the end for the verb that enlivens the sentence.
Yeah, that's true. So there's work, Patel and Danielle, their work on pairwise variability index and how the rhythms in music that's not sung, that's instrumental music, parallels the pairwise variability index for what goes on in the language. And in my own lab, we've done the same thing with contrasting Chinese folk songs with Germanic folk songs and so on. But those can be sort of easily attributable to the kinds of imitation or familiarity you have with some linguistic or some sonic environment. So I think you can say that it's a pretty straightforward function. It has to do with whatever familiarity you have. You're going to have the same thing with phonemic familiarity, whatever phones that are used in the language and so on.
But I mean, there's structure. I mean,
there's structure there. That's right. And the structure relates to the culture. Yeah.
In terms of the difficulty of studying language that Dale referred to, what would draw people's attention to a paper that David Poppel wrote published in 2005, book chapter actually, in which he talks about the incommensurability problem in neurolinguistics. So we have all these linguistic theories which you nicely pointed to, the Chomskyan sort of tradition, in which the focus is on syntax and symbolic, processing of abstract symbols and so forth. But when you look at what's going on in the brain, whether you're doing single unit recordings or you're looking at EEG or an MEG, what you see are action potentials and oscillations and synchronizations and so forth. And those two just are completely different animals. And I think linguistic research, and I wouldn't classify your research actually in this way, but much linguistic research really suffers from this problem that there doesn't seem to be any way to put these two things together without completely reframing the language problem and making some commitments about representations. Did I just say that word, representation? about what language looks like in the brain. Sure. What is a word in the brain?
There are certain sort of assumed dichotomies in this entire conversation. So, for example, when we refer to music, by and large, the idea, in fact, is codified music, because generationally, people are experimenting with musics all the time. And you just pop on the local college radio at 1 a.m. and I'll find violations of all the things that we've been discussing all day. I find it delightful if I'm inebriated, and less so if I'm trying to do some work. So that's music. That's fluid, wonderful, dynamic music. And in the same sense, I think we're making certain assumptions about speech versus language, and mere vocalization versus mere language, or music versus. It seems that these are dichotomies that are sort of puzzling to me, and they seem to be driven by some of the research questions rather than facts of matter about the universe. And so I'm entirely sympathetic to what Ed just said, and I think it's true that there's a certain incommensurability between these sort of representational formats, let's just call them. But you have stable intersubjective agreement among even linguists about what a word is. Probably even more intersubjective agreement, which is fundamental scientific criterion, by the way.
But I would say
representation
that intersubjective agreement among scientists about what a word is the main problem in neurolinguistics.
Sure, but the other assumption here is, and let me just bring it up here because I think you will resonate with this given the brief discussion we had at dinner. There's a kind of neurocentrism in the entire discussion here, and I think that there's an important sense in which the level of analysis that we can conduct over culture and over abstract levels of language are being subjected to their own kind of quantification in 21st century information sciences and data science. And they're powerful domains within which we can produce hypotheses and conduct explorations about how languages are distributed in the world and the way that languages are being used. It's a level of analysis that admits to its own sort of structure. Chris is frowning and shaking his head.
Sorry. Well, I want to just go back to this language point. I mean, I think the problem here is that we're equating the study of language with generative grammar, which is really, I mean, I think Chomsky really did a disservice in that respect, I gotta say. So just give you a couple examples. Zipf's law, scale-free networks. These are things that are absolutely not totally commensurate, I should say, with brain, with all sorts of biology and nature, and you find them everywhere in the structure of language. And so if you just look at language, a better way, I would say, you'll find that this is not incommensurate. It's quite amenable to study. You just need to take a different approach. And you all of a sudden you see laws, you see regularities. You're not going to see them with Chomsky's generative grammar.
Right. You need to take that's really my point. Is that, and that was Popple's point, and that's what his research program is now, for example. Is that you need to take an approach to language. You need to reframe the language program so that you can do productive work at the neural basis of language.
Right. So I think this ties a bunch of things together. I think there's something that is universal in music and in language, and it is shared in music and language, and it's very amenable to neuroscientific study, and I don't think it's been that studied, which is that both of them, there might not be universal scales, but I think that all music have a scale. Maybe the ethnomusicologist can correct me, but at least I'm sure that they have a set of sounds that you can make predictions about, and they all create, language and music create expectations and violate those expectations. And we need both to convey meaning. Something that is completely unpredictable has no meaning. Something that is exactly the same every time has no meaning. And those are things that are created during your lifetime, and they are created in a matter of seconds too. So in different time scales, you're learning the statistics of your language or your music, and those things are permanently violated.
Well, I think both of those, I think a word in the brain might not be the scale of analysis that's useful, but language in the brain is exactly however we defined affect or valence in the brain earlier, that it's whatever ripple across the network is caused by this signal going in our ear. So in that sense, language for me is
not just the ripple going into your ear, but your conscious will and of course
ripple across our systems.
But your conscious listening for that as language. Your repertoire of understanding of language, and your conscious will to understand. So what goes on in the brain is not just a passive response to external stimuli. It is very much you create your own sensations, your own perceptual, your own percepts.
Yeah, I don't think a word is meaning. I think a word brings online a meaningful representation.
But what happens in what I'm saying is, what happens in the brain is very much a product of those two,
In language and music.
in both language and music.
So can I ask, Rick, what is the intersubjective agreement about what a word is?
No, I think that so for example, in the case, let's just take the case of morphology. I mean, in general, and even in just morphological linguistics, there's a general stable agreement on what are the forms that are being used to explain the compositional structure of word formation in languages. And so there's a strong agreement. Now, I agree with your assessment that really drawing linkages between those forms.
I actually meant what is a word in the brain. So.
Oh no, I don't mean in the brain. I just mean
the
unit of analysis of study. And I agree with this. Chris's point was very intriguing, but I think that there's a heck of a lot more than just power laws.
Sure.
Like, of course. Yeah, and so I think that when I was saying there's subjective agreement, I meant that they're units of analysis,
okay.
Which are measured via intuition, no doubt. But their intersubjective agreement about words is actually quite strong. And your intersubjective agreement about brain states that are cognitively relevant actually seems quite wildly in disagreement among. Now, I love the brain, and I think studying the brain is really important.
No, but it's a wide disagreement among neuroscientists. What is a brain state? Right? Like it is not a definable quantity. I mean, it's such a complex system. Are you going to freeze it over time and say, at this instance, it's the brain state, right? So it's an intractable question, in my opinion. But on the other hand, there are principles of neural organization that, let's take this in a positive way. So there are principles of neural organization that might be common across music and language. So let's sort of take this in the NSF direction, right? Which is, how might the study of music inform the dynamics of language? So, so they don't get stuck looking for words in the brain. And how might the sciences of language tell music cognition people, like where they might be, looking for more interesting answers? And I think that is really the sort of chief objective of this workshop, and I just want to see some constructive dialogue here on that front. Yes?
I think when thinking about language, it's also good to not stick to language as words, right? Language is, what makes language interesting is that it's more than words, that you need to get information active over a longer period of time and combine the information, and that's exactly what's happening in music. And there, you have to, it's not only one tone, it's the how it's developing over time and how that is integrated that is interesting. And there you see a lot of similarities also in underlying neuronal mechanisms. So.
Has anyone on the panel heard of Area 44 or Area 47? You have? Was that a shape?
Are you talking about
Broadband
area?
What? Sorry?
You're talking about broadband area?
I'm not an neuropsychologist.
Okay.
Whatever you guys do.
You're talking about an area of the brain.
An area of brain, yeah, sorry.
We're going to keep the aliens.
I don't know much about it. I heard about it recently at a conference. They showed the brain, and this is months ago when I didn't know anything about the brain until wonderful people. And so they just showed the Area 44, Area 47 are in the brain, and one processes music and one processes language, and they're very, very close to one another. And I was just wondering from cognitive science if you guys have heard of this phenomenon or where this is coming from. I haven't gotten to do that work on that.
Well, I think that the idea that there's any a single identifiable area in the brain that processes language and a different identifiable single area in the brain that processes music is just wildly oversimplistic.
Can I just get back, because there you really wouldn't say that like one is language and one is music, but those are areas that are important in keeping information online for a longer period of time and combining information and looking at where competition, like things that compete for integration and selecting relevant information and so on. So that is sort of the underlying processes that are relevant for both music and languages.
In those two areas?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't even know what that means. I'm just kind of curious.
So, David and then David.
I have a comment. It's a little bit off topic here, but I feel motivated to talk about it because it's the single most important thing that I've come away from this workshop with. And I just wanted to mention it. It won't come as anything new to the people who are linguists and to deal with language here, but coming from music, what Rick had to say, all of the aspect of the movement and all of these other aspects of language that don't have to do with speech, I found fascinating and compelling and interesting the parallels to what's going on and how we're reinterpreting what's going on with music. Because if we want to know which aspects of music are universal, they're likely latched into things that an ethologist would call a signal. And one of the ways in which biologists make a distinction between whether a display is a signal or as a cue is what biologists call conspicuousness. If the intention is to communicate, you don't want to hide that under a bushel. The idea is you need to make it conspicuous. And one of the classic symptoms of conspicuousness is multimodality. So the people who've been doing all this affect work, doing facial expressions, the problem is they haven't asked the question that any ethologist would ask, which is, what's the sound associated with that? So we alluded to that when we talked about the smile, that the thing about a smile is that you can hear it. And this is exactly what an ethologist would look for in terms of conspicuousness, the multimodality of this. So when you start looking at the facial expressions that an ethologist would say this qualifies as a signal, you have to ask what's conspicuous, what aspect of the visual component is conspicuous, and what's the associated sound. So for example, in Joe's work on sarcasm, when you look at the sneer face that Ekman describes as the asymmetrical version of the disgust response, where you're doing this, and any good ethologist would immediately ask, what's the effect, what's the sound? It's the what you're doing when you do that is you add nasalization to this, and now or the protein thing, all of that stuff. The problem with the people who've done all this stuff on affect, especially related to facial expression, is they never looked at sound. And the reciprocal problem that we did on the auditory side was we never looked at vision. We never thought, what's the component here? So if we ask the question, what are those aspects of sound that are most likely to be universally communicated, what an ethologist would call a signal? They're the sounds that people make that are likely to be associated with a distinctive facial expression. Right? So this gives us a real leg up. And so what was striking for me was this realization that, oh, and I never thought about language or speech this way. The people, in a sense, the people missing from the room, I think it's great. It's great that we have the music people and the speech people and the neuroscience people here all together. The people that are missing from the room are the people that do visual affect. Because I think we've got a real dialogue with them. And that's sort of, for me, the most important thing I learned from this workshop.
I was just going to make the point about Area 47 that I think somebody else, I forgot who made the statement that's absolutely right, that whether you use as stimulus material, music, or language, enormous areas of the brain are activated in both domains, and it's really enormously dangerous to think of, given present knowledge, any definitive localization of either one. They overlap enormously. So Area 47, maybe not such a hot idea.
Ramesh, I was just going to say, going back to your question about how can music inform language and language inform music, nobody has yet really talked about development and learning. And so we're all talking as if the brain is fully formed and it can process whatever we give it and so on. And of course, that's not the case at all. And so I suspect that by looking at young infants and what they acquire early and the manner in which they acquire music and the manner in which they acquire language is going to tell us a tremendous amount about the commonalities between them. I mean, just to think of one example, perceptual narrowing is something that happens in both domains around the same time. So whatever tonal system you're listening to around 1 year of age, your brain is becoming specialized for that. Whatever phoneme categories you have in your environment, by 1 year you're specialized for that. So I think you really have to look, if you want to understand the brain, you have to know how it got to its state. And this goes back to universals or proclivities or all of those things.
Stability.
Stability. I mean, if no matter what input you give it, you end up in a similar place. And that's telling you something deep about maturation and structure of the brain. But if there's huge effects of the input that you get, then that's telling you that there's some things that the system, maybe some states the system may be more likely to end up in, but that there's a huge variety of things that you can end up in. So I think examining how it develops is really crucial.
And I think development is often neglected in important debates of this kind, and I'm very glad you brought that up.
Debates between adults.
Yes.
Can I ask a question there? Do you think that for and influence language and music are true?
That's a really good question. I've thought a lot about it. I don't know how you test it, but I think that, I don't know if they're exactly the same, but I think for a very young infant, they're much less differentiated than for an adult. I mean, in both cases, they don't have a mature, prefrontal lobes and so on to interpret in the way that we as adults interpret things. So really, what they're doing is processing whatever input is coming in. And I think it's actually through that processing of the input and saying, okay, the language has these consonant vowel sort of structure, and music has these tones that seem to last for a while. So it's really through learning that structure that they become differentiated. That, I can't point you to any evidence that's going to demonstrate that definitively, but it would make sense to me. And I think also if you look at the way we interact with infants, early on we really don't differentiate music and language for them. The way we talk, we call it musical speech, the way we talk to them, and it really has, all these features we were talking about with music. It has repetition, it has pitch patterning, and when we think of the way we sing to them, it has a lot of the features of language. So it's more improvisational the way we sing to a baby. We look immediately for their reaction, and we change how we're singing depending on what they're doing, which we don't typically do with a musical piece that's already composed. So the input that we're giving them is less differentiated early on. And it's not clear that they react so differently to that input early on.
I have a related question. Does anybody else think that this picture that I've been staring at us... I can change it. Oh, that's okay. So all of us in this room are very, 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 very good at speaking and have been for a long, long time. And I wonder if the reason that music appears more like the left-hand side of this picture as opposed to the right-hand side is that we're all so exquisite linguists. And but very few of us have attained a very high level of musicianship. And I wonder if maybe the reason we see music in these hexagonal structures as opposed to these more chaotic ones, which are natural and perfect in the sense that they're natural, is that we don't need music the way we need language. We don't learn it as quickly, perhaps, divided.
I've been very jealous of musicians that can look like that. Personally,
Yeah,
I wish
right.
I could be like that myself.
I actually
That's a really good point.
That as soon as I saw that slide, because this slide is why I had this conference, this slide right here. But on that note, what you're saying is I'm wondering if you look at how music manifests in children, and someone was talking about Snowball and how he moves and whatnot, music doesn't manifest like that. Music manifests the right-hand column. We train it to become that. We make what kids do rhythmic. We make what they do perfect. We want them to match pitch. All of those things. But anyone who's worked with a 2-year-old knows they don't come out matching pitch.
But
right?
We're also
we do
quite
that.
We're also quite musical without having any,
Exactly.
explicit training or at all. So we have a lot of implicit knowledge about, pitch and tonality, and we're actually quite good musicians without any expertise. And so instead of, back to your question, instead of comparing as, we're all very good orators or something like that, because we do speak a lot. And instead of comparing that to musicianship, you might want to compare that to just natural singing, at church on Sunday, or late at night after you've had a few drinks or something like that. Because I think that's maybe a better comparison.
But I do agree with what you're saying, though, about the improv. I was talking to somebody about this yesterday. If we all sang the amount that we spoke, we would be on that side with language. We would be able to improvise any key. If we sang in every key all day long, but we don't.
You would hate me, though.
Yeah.
The church song and the drinking song are like the picture on the left. They're simple, they're structured, they're hexagonal, and the thoughts that we're able to produce to one another on a daily basis in everyday life.
So we think
Are
of it
more
as being
on
simple because components that we generally share, for example, let's say a notation, ends up being structured in this way. There's all kinds of elements to the performances that are much less.
Right. And if you think back to what Chris said, he said, well, I don't want you to think about a musical performance.
Right.
But so in a way, you're comparing apples to oranges. So you're saying some kind of notated structure over here compared to, free-form conversational speech.
No, I'm sorry.
So
no,
really, if you wanted to compare apples and apples, you'd be comparing musical performances with.
Or you could compare the compositionality of the two. So you could do both. And I think it's important to do both. In this case, I was referring to more the compositionality of both. But you're right, otherwise it's happening all the
I
time.
think language would look a lot less messy if you zoomed way out or way in.
That could be.
It also depends on what aspect of language you're looking at. Is
Look
there
at
a
written
point, is
language.
there a beginning, is there an end, it depends on what level you're coming from.
And this means it starts. And how do we know that, 40,000 years ago we didn't all sound like a church preacher? We have no idea. We have really no way of knowing at what point music and singing started as language developed, and then we went backward and inward onto ourselves. So again, I'm not sure how much we impose and how much is a natural thing. Sorry.
Did you want to? I saw Drew's hand, and then go ahead. Go ahead, Drew.
I mean, this is actually exactly, I was going to ask a question that you, right at the end, kind of backed up. So my question is about development and being intentional about teaching children about music or about language, or we're looking at these mathematical fractals and more naturalistic types of fractals, and that we like empirical ones. And there's a lot of structure in the environment that we just observe, acoustically through light, and these are, you can call them incidental, but infants interact with that, they perceive. I'm assuming they're perceiving these properties of the environment. They produce these properties as well. Parts of their own system, their own body, their heart rate, are developing these rhythms. And so Lily gave a poster kind of similar to this idea. So how much of this is intentional learning through other organisms and so caregivers and people that interact, social kind of things, and how much is maybe just experiencing the world they live in and just part of that as well.
Well, people become, as you said, people become musical without any formal training. So just the way you learn a language without any formal training. So when you go to school to learn to read, you become better at language, but when a child enters school, they really are a fluent speaker of their language. They're also, in our society, they're at least a fluent perceiver of music. They're not always a fluent producer of music, but I think that's probably fairly specific to our culture. In most of the places you go in the world, people are producing music and singing all the time, and the children are just part of it. So parents are singing to they're rocking their infants and singing to them to sleep and all these kinds of things. We do that in the West, but we do it less. And I think one of the reasons we do it less is because of recorded music. We can put them in a crib now and turn on music for them, and we don't have to hold them and give them that. We're talking about multimodal experiences. I mean, through evolution through our history, human history, the experiences an infant had with music were very multimodal. So the caregiver would hold the infant would smell the mother, they would see the mother, they would be rocked, they would get the proprioception, the tactile, and the singing. So it would be a very multimodal musical experience that they would get from, you could even argue prenatally. Whereas in our society, they get some of that, but probably less. And so I find it fascinating that now we take our children, there are all these classes for infants and parents, music classes for infants and parents. It's almost as if we have to institutionalize that because it may not be happening so naturally in our culture anymore. But that's sort of a long-winded answer, but the short answer to your question is, yeah, people learn musical structure just the way they learn language, just through exposure and having people around them producing music.
I also have one point to add about language and music as a developmental wise. For language, you always need to make a connection between a certain sound that's arbitrary to its meaning. Like during development, this kind of coupling has to be consistent. It should be like relatively consistent for it to gather meaning. So you hear a cat, you see a cat. Next time you hear a cat, you also see a cat. So that's how you build meaning. But when infants listen to music, they don't necessarily couple that to a certain element of the environment. This kind of co-occurrence is not consistent, so that they may not be building that kind of connection.
Yeah, I mean, I would actually disagree because I think with the infant, the way you sing an infant to sleep is very different than the way you play with an infant. And so they are experiencing different kinds of music, different tempos, different pitch structures, different rhythms in different situations. So it's not clear how much of that's intrinsic. So I think Ed would argue a lot of it's intrinsic to the structure of the music, how you would perceive it, but it's hard to tease apart developmentally because the different kinds of music are produced in different situations.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's not necessarily different kind of fractal structures. If you look at language, and especially language evolution, you do a lot of this, right, looking at, let's say, second language, greater population of second language speakers in a certain language population versus in a population without those. And there are different kind of social pressures to have those things. And your point back there about maybe in music there are different kinds of uses for that, in which maybe people are learning that later, maybe people are producing it, and maybe not. But maybe there are different kinds of social pressures being put on these to make music go in this way. And I don't know if there's any types of musical evolution modeling that could be kind of interesting there, per se, to show these kinds of proclivities. And I'm not saying that there aren't any neural kind of underpinnings towards universes, but to kind of find what crossing for this, I don't know, clarity. It's there.
Is there a model of music evolution? Agent-based simulations or something like that? Are you familiar with that?
I don't know. Do you know?
Modeling of music evolution, meaning?
Well, there is
there are evolutionary algorithms that
there is actually a community of language evolution researchers who use computational models to identify potential boundary conditions around potential ways in which language would have emerged in different communities. So you can implement different learning mechanisms in the agents or different environmental conditions and so on. So I guess Sam's question is just, can you imagine modeling?
Yeah, do you think that would be useful in this situation?
It would be interesting to, I mean, if you took to say the history of Western music as we know it, that we started more things along Gregorian chant, and how would you get from one stage to the next, and what would push you to add various things, and I think
I think we were talking a little bit about that actually today from maybe a slightly different point of view. But yeah, absolutely, I think that would be very interesting, very useful.
And of course, a lot of that came from the changing in of the architecture. Gregorian chant is about the only thing you can do in a Gothic cathedral that makes any musical sense. And once you have electric guitars, you can do things that you couldn't do before. So those aren't necessarily, Platonic evolutionary schemes. However, for instance, the simplification of grammar that's going on now in languages, including English, of course, would be something that an evolutionary someone who studied the evolution of language could try to model.
Yeah, that was actually something I was going to say earlier, but the conversation went a different direction, and that's, language seems to have I'm not a linguist, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to have a tendency to simplify. So, we shorten things, once we have a common, we know that means this, we tend to shorten it, we, make the vowels easier to say, we do all these things, whereas in music we don't. We don't shorten the music because we've got a good idea. If anything, we're going to prolong it and enjoy it, and so there doesn't seem that same tendency.
But is that true about language? I mean, I understand these processes of simplification, but are modern languages somehow simpler than they were 1,000 years ago? I don't think so. There must be must be other forces that are complexifying at the same time you have these simplifications.
Yeah, so there are various forces that might work towards changing, let's just call it the grammar of language in general. So the study that Sam was mentioning was with, in collaboration with Gary Lupin, and we found that generally the demographics of the society predict the simplicity of the morphosyntactic system. And so in general, languages in a sense do simplify as populations grow. And in fact, this tendency, and in fact, over human history, that's just been a fact of human existence, is that populations have been growing. And so the linguist Peter Trudgill has this really cool discussion of when you're conducting a kind of statistical analysis over languages, you have to carry out certain statistical controls, like areal controls. So where are languages distributed on the globe? You'd expect languages to be relatively similar if they're close together just by pure chance. And also familial controls. So if you have a hypothesis about language, you have to control for the phylogeny of the language. But Peter Trudgill proposes that we also have to control for the chronemic aspects of language, because there's been this essential march towards simplicity over time. And he talks about these languages that are going extinct, that are obscenely complex. You have these languages that have massive numbers, for example, temporal semantic distinctions that are obligatory on the verb. So the idea is that if I'm going to say something in past tense, I have to specify the specific point in time in the past I have to say it. As an English speaker, this would be insanely difficult. And it turns out that these languages are being lost, and in fact, modern languages are becoming more and more morphosyntactically simple. But David's point is that they are becoming more complex lexically. So now we actually have a much larger lexicon to utilize. And in fact, we typically refer to those languages as isolating languages, or languages that use a lexical strategy. So rather than having a really complex grammar, we can actually just string a series of words together. So in fact, English and Mandarin are maybe just quite uncoincidentally similar in their grammatical patterns. They're both radically isolating languages that have fundamentally stripped the morphosyntactic structure. So I think both intuitions are correct. It's just how we measure complexity may depend, but in terms of morphology and syntax, yeah, it's becoming simpler. But I think in the case of music, is something similar happening in music. So as societies are growing in size and becoming more interconnected, and information technology is shaping the exposure to everything, what's happening to musical systems? And how are they? Obviously, I think moving into these sort of universal modes is what's taking place here, right? And this is discussed extensively, I assume, in the ethnomusicology context with disappointment, right? That there's diversity that's being lost.
But there's also, sorry Greg, I'm going to get to you right just half a second.
Sure.
But there's also, like Laurel was saying, very, very interesting new things that are coming out. There are like Western musicians that are composing with microtones. There are people who are using Western scales but use Indian style oscillations between notes. And like Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan was a great example, a Pakistani Qawwali singer who records with Peter Gabriel. I think these are incredible things that would not have been possible. And I don't think either style has been compromised because they kind of came together. Sorry, I'll stop there. Great.
Well, I mean, that segues perfectly into what I was going to say. It seems technology, I mean, just to connect to what you're saying, technology creates a situation where the dynamics of the current situation with how music and language are changing might not be the way it has gone for most of evolutionary history. I mean, with musicians are integrating styles in ways that you would never have imagined 200 years ago, which is a blink of the eye, evolutionarily. But I was going to, just to draw on what you were saying about music evolution, there's some work, and I wish I could remember the authors, but people that study language evolution will often look at how changes in language across time correlate with people's genes. So you can tell where people are from by looking at certain markers. And then you look at the language, and sometimes the language actually gives you more information about where people are from than the genes, but you can make a correlation there. But there's a study that happened recently, and maybe somebody can tell me who did it, because I can't remember, in Southeast Asia, which has a huge diversity of language. There was a study looking at people knowing folk songs that predicted where they were from better than the dialect that they spoke, or the language that they spoke. And I just thought that was really fascinating, that there's something about music that actually retained their cultural heritage better than the language.
Stephen Brown has done some work also, I think in Micronesia.
No, in Taiwan.